She spoke the ancient words he never expected. The Alpha King froze when he realized she was his true Luna. The town of Ashwick did not appear on most maps. It sat in the gap between two worlds, the kind of place travelers passed through without remembering its name. Old houses leaned against each other like tired friends. The main road cracked a little more every winter, and nobody ever fixed it. Most people who lived there had grown up there, and most of them never left, because leaving required a reason, and Ashwick did not give people reasons for anything. Sarah Voss had lived there her whole life, in a small house at the edge of town, in a room that still smelled faintly of her grandmother's tea, even 6 months after her grandmother had died. She worked at the town archive, 3 streets from her house, in a building that used to be a chapel before the town ran out of people who prayed. Her job title was translator, though nobody in Ashwick needed anything translated. She spent her days going through boxes of old letters, ship manifests, and torn diary pages that historians from the city occasionally sent her, hoping she could make sense of languages that had stopped being spoken generations ago. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. Her grandmother used to say that some people are born with music in their hands, and some are born with words in their mouths that don't belong to any one century. Sarah didn't think much about what that meant. Not until the night everything in her life stopped making sense in the ordinary way and started making sense in an entirely different way. It started with her grandmother's prayers. For as long as Sarah could remember, her grandmother had taught her to recite a set of phrases before bed, the way other grandmothers taught their grandchildren nursery rhymes. Sarah didn't understand a single word. The syllables didn't match any language she had ever studied, and she had studied dozens. When she asked what the words meant, her grandmother would only smile and say, "You'll know when it matters. Just don't forget them." So Sarah didn't forget them. She said them so many times as a child that they became part of her, the way a scar becomes part of skin. She stopped questioning them around the same time she stopped believing her grandmother would ever explain. Her grandmother died in the spring, quietly, in her sleep, with an unfinished cup of tea on the nightstand. She left no letter, no explanation, just the words, buried somewhere deep in Sarah's memory, waiting. Sarah didn't think about them again until the night of the attack. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. She had stayed late at the archive, sorting through a box of shipping records nobody would ever read, and by the time she left, the sky had gone the color of a bruise. She was halfway home when she heard the first scream. Ashwick sat close enough to the wild country that people knew, in the careful, unspoken way small towns know things, that something lived in the woods beyond the tree line. Nobody said the word wolf out loud. Not really, not unless they had been drinking. But everyone kept their doors locked after dark, and everyone taught their children to run, not scream, if they ever saw something large moving low to the ground. Sarah had never seen one, not until that night. It came out of the trees near the old grain store, moving fast, low, wrong in a way that made her stomach drop before her mind caught up. It wasn't like an animal in a nature documentary. It moved like something that used to be a person and had lost the thread of what that meant. People scattered. Someone knocked over a cart of vegetables. A woman was screaming a child's name. The child. Sarah saw her before she made any decision to help. A small girl, maybe 6 years old, had fallen near the curb, and the wolf thing was closing the distance between them in a way that left no time for anyone to reach her first. Sarah didn't remember deciding to run toward the girl instead of away from the danger. Her body simply did it, the way your hand pulls back from a hot stove before your brain finishes registering the heat. She reached the girl and stood between her and the creature, arms out, no plan, no weapon, nothing but her own body, between a child and something that could tear through both of them without slowing down. And then, without meaning to, without understanding why, she started speaking. The words came out of her like something that had been standing behind a door her whole life, waiting for someone to open it. They weren't loud. They weren't a shout or a scream. They came out low and steady, the same rhythm her grandmother had used every night at bedtime, syllables that meant nothing to Sarah, and yet felt, in that moment, like the only thing in the world that was true. The creature stopped. It didn't attack. It didn't retreat either, not at first. It stood there, muscles coiled, head tilted, staring at her the way something stares at a sound it has never heard before and doesn't know what to do with. For 3 full seconds, the entire street held its breath along with her. Then the sound of something else arrived. Heavy footsteps, fast and controlled, more than one set, moving with the kind of coordination that told Sarah, even in her panic, that whoever was coming knew exactly what they were doing. A group of men appeared at the edge of the street, and at the front of them was someone Sarah would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately and never quite managing. He was tall in a way that made the space around him feel smaller. He wore no uniform, nothing that marked him as anyone official, and yet everyone around him moved like soldiers around a commander. His eyes found the creature first, and something passed between them, some silent order that made the wolf thing lower its head and back away into the trees without another sound. Only then did his eyes move to Sarah. She would remember, later, that his expression didn't change the way a normal person's expression changes when they see something surprising. He didn't widen his eyes or take a step back. He simply went still, the way water goes still right before it freezes, and for a moment, nobody in the street moved at all. He walked toward her slowly, the way you might walk toward something you were afraid to startle. When he was close enough to speak without raising his voice, he said one word, "Again." Sarah blinked. "What?" "Say it again. What you just said." She didn't know what she had said. She barely remembered saying anything, but something in his voice, low and urgent in a way that didn't match the calm control he had walked in with, made her want to obey without asking why. She opened her mouth, and the words came again, unbidden, the same as before. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something in his face had shifted, though Sarah couldn't have said exactly what. He looked at her the way you look at a door you didn't know was there, standing in a wall you thought you understood completely. "Who are you?" he said, and it wasn't a question so much as a demand for the world to explain itself. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Voss." He didn't offer his name in return. Instead, he turned to the men behind him and said something short and quiet that Sarah couldn't hear. 2 of them stepped forward. "You're coming with us," he said. "I just saved a child," Sarah said, her voice climbing with disbelief. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," he said. "That's exactly the problem." She didn't understand what he meant. Not that night. It would take her weeks to understand it fully, and by then, understanding it would have already changed her life beyond anything she could undo. His name, she would learn before the night was over, was Cale Dravan, and he was the alpha king of a pack most of Ashwick pretended not to believe in. Cale had not expected his evening to end this way. He had ridden out with his men because a report had reached him of a rogue wolf attacking a human settlement near the border, the kind of incident that happened more often than the human world knew and less often than his own advisors worried about. Rogues were wolves who had lost their pack, their mind, or both, and they were dangerous exactly because they answered to no one and belonged nowhere. Dealing with them was simple. Find them, stop them, make sure no human remembered anything clearly enough to matter. That was the plan. It had been the plan 100 times before, and Cale had executed it 100 times without complication. Then he heard the woman speaking, and the plan stopped mattering. He recognized the language before his mind had time to tell him that recognizing it was impossible. It was old. Older than his pack's written records, older than the founding of Silvermore itself. It was a language he had only ever seen in fragments, carved into stone tablets his historians kept locked away and rarely discussed. A language they called, with a kind of reverence that always struck Cale as slightly foolish, the first tongue. It was said to be the language spoken by the earliest Lunas, the mates of the very first alphas, back when the bond between wolf and mate was something raw and unshaped, before centuries of rules and ceremony smoothed it into what it had become. No living person spoke it. No living person could have learned it, because there was nothing left to learn it from except broken pieces in old stone. And yet a human woman, standing in the middle of a dying town with no wolf blood in her at all, had just spoken it as easily as breathing. Cale's wolf, a part of him that had been silent for 4 years, made a sound in his chest that he hadn't felt since before his mate died. It wasn't quite a howl, it was closer to recognition. The kind of recognition that comes before the mind has agreed to it, the body simply knowing something the person hasn't caught up to yet. He had buried that part of himself a long time ago, on purpose, with effort, the way you bury something you're afraid might come back to life if you don't press the dirt down hard enough. 4 years since Yara died in an ambush he had been too slow, too careless, too confident to prevent. 4 years of ruling a pack that needed him steady, not shattered, so he had made himself steady, cold, dependable in the particular way that only comes from deciding, once and for all, never to feel anything sharply again. Then this woman opened her mouth in the middle of a burning street, and something inside him that he had declared closed for business simply woke up. He did not like it. He told himself, riding back to Silvermore with Sarah under guard beside him, that this was a matter of pack security. A human who could speak the first tongue was either an enormous threat or an enormous discovery, and either possibility required containment and study. That was the story he told his advisors. It was mostly the story he told himself. It was not, if he was honest, the whole story. The mountain that housed Silvermore's court was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen, and she had spent her whole life reading about places she assumed she would never visit. The main hall was carved into stone that seemed to breathe with age, lit by fires that never seemed to need tending, filled with people who moved like they belonged to something larger than themselves. She was given a room that felt more like a cage, dressed up as comfort. Fine furniture, a soft bed, windows that didn't open, and 2 guards outside her door who wouldn't meet her eyes when she tried to talk to them. For 3 days, nobody explained anything to her. On the 4th day, an old woman came to see her. She introduced herself as Ilsa, one of the pack's historians, and she carried with her a stack of ancient-looking books that looked like they might crumble if handled too roughly. "You don't know what you are," Ilsa said, not unkindly, settling into the chair across from Sarah without waiting for an invitation. "I know exactly what I am," Sarah said. "I'm a translator from a town most maps don't bother with, and I would very much like to go home." Ilsa smiled, the kind of smile that carried more sadness than amusement. "You are the first human being in 300 years to speak the first tongue. Do you understand what that means?" "No," Sarah admitted. "Nobody has explained it to me. I've mostly been sitting in this room being stared at." So Ilsa explained. She told Sarah about the old prophecy, fragmented and disputed among the pack scholars, buried in texts so old that most young wolves had never heard of it. It spoke of a woman who did not carry wolf blood but carried instead something rarer, the first tongue itself, passed silently through generations of human bloodlines, dormant, waiting, until the moment a bloodline needed her most. "The bloodline," Sarah repeated. "You mean Cale's?" "I mean the Alpha's line," Ilsa said carefully, "which has had no Luna and no heir for 4 years, since his mate was killed." Sarah absorbed that slowly. "So you think I'm supposed to be his Luna, because of a language my grandmother happened to teach me and never explain?" "I think," Ilsa said, "that your grandmother knew exactly what she was preparing you for, even if she never told you." Sarah didn't know what to do with that. She had spent her whole life assuming her grandmother's stubborn insistence on those nightly words was simply the eccentricity of an old woman who missed a home she never spoke about. The idea that it had been preparation, deliberate and purposeful, for something as enormous as this, made her chest tight in a way she didn't have words for, in any language. "What does Cale think?" she asked. Ilsa's expression shifted. "Careful now. The Alpha does not believe in prophecy." "Then why am I still here?" Ilsa didn't answer that question. She simply gathered her books and left, and Sarah sat alone in her too fine room, turning the same thought over and over. If he didn't believe in the prophecy, why hadn't he let her go home? Cale told himself every single day for the first 2 weeks, that Sarah Voss remained at Silvermore purely for study. His historians needed to understand how a human carried the first tongue. His advisors needed to determine whether she posed any threat. These were reasonable, practical concerns, the kind any responsible alpha would investigate. He did not examine too closely why he was the one who ended up sitting across from her most evenings, going over pack law and history that his historians could have easily taught her instead. Their sessions started as formal, businesslike things. He would explain how pack hierarchy worked, how territory was divided, why certain rules existed and how they had come to exist. She would listen, ask sharper questions than he expected, and occasionally correct small historical details his own scholars had gotten wrong, because she had spent a lifetime doing exactly this kind of careful work with old and broken sources. In exchange, she taught him fragments of the first tongue, the sounds his historians had never gotten quite right because no living voice had ever corrected them. She taught him how to shape certain vowels, how the language moved differently through a mouth than the written symbols suggested. It required closeness neither of them had planned for. Leaning in to hear a whispered syllable correctly, watching a mouth shape a sound you were trying to copy, sitting near enough, for long enough, that silence between sentences stopped feeling awkward and started feeling like something else entirely. Cale noticed himself slipping, the way a man notices ice cracking under his feet, aware of the danger and unable to stop walking anyway. He found himself arriving to their sessions early. He found himself remembering things she said hours after she said them, turning her sentences over the way he used to turn over battle strategy, searching for meaning he might have missed the first time. Sarah noticed too, though she didn't trust it. He was not an easy man to read. He guarded himself the way some people guard a wound, flinching before anyone even gets close enough to touch it. She had grown up around quiet people, people who kept things buried, and she recognized in Cale the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent years holding himself together through sheer will. She didn't make it easy for him. She wasn't going to spend her life as someone's convenient prophecy, and she told him so, more than once, in blunt and unpolished language that made his advisors visibly uncomfortable and made something flicker, briefly, at the corner of his mouth. "You could just tell me the truth," she said one evening, weeks into their strange arrangement, as they sat across a table covered in old texts neither of them had looked at in the last hour. "About why you keep me here. I told you, study. You've studied me for 6 weeks. What have you learned?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer at all. "That I don't know what to do with you," he said finally, "and I've never once in 4 years said that about anything." It wasn't a confession of love. It wasn't even close. But it was the most honest thing he had said to her since the night they met, and Sarah felt it land somewhere she hadn't expected, somewhere that had been closed for a long time and was, apparently, still capable of opening. The conversation about his first mate happened by accident, the way the truest conversations usually do. They had been working through an old passage together, a fragment of text that used a phrase Sarah couldn't quite translate. It described something being taken before its season, a construction that had no clean equivalent in modern language. Without thinking, without meaning to say anything personal at all, she looked up and asked, in the first tongue because it was simply the language they had been using, what had been taken from him. She didn't fully understand her own question until she saw his face. Cale went still in the specific way he had gone still the night they met, the way of a man standing at the edge of something he had spent years walking carefully around. For a moment, Sarah thought he would simply end the session and leave, the way he had ended other conversations that veered too close to something he didn't want examined. Instead, he answered, in the first tongue, in words that came out of him strangely fluent for someone who had only just begun learning the language, as though some part of him had been waiting a long time to say this in a tongue that wouldn't flinch at it. He told her about Yara, not everything, not all at once, but enough. A mate chosen young, an ambush his scouts should have caught and didn't, a death that happened while he was 3 minutes too far away to stop it. He told her about the years that followed, the decision, conscious and deliberate, to become the kind of alpha who didn't feel things sharply anymore, because feeling things sharply had nearly destroyed him once, and he wasn't willing to risk it a second time. "I built walls," he said, back in the common language now, his voice rough in a way Sarah had never heard from him. "Good ones. I was proud of them." "And now?" Sarah asked quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. "Now I keep finding cracks I didn't know were there." Neither of them slept well that night. Sarah lay awake turning his words over, trying to decide what to do with a man who had just handed her something so carefully guarded and then said nothing else about it. Cale sat alone in his study long after the fires had burned low, staring at nothing, aware that something inside him had shifted in a way he could no longer pretend not to notice. The trouble arrived, as trouble often does, from a direction nobody had been watching closely enough. There were wolves within Silvermore who had, for 4 years, benefited quietly from Cale's refusal to take a Luna. A pack without a Luna concentrated certain decisions in ways that made a small circle of advisors comfortable and powerful. A true Luna, especially one tied to an old prophecy that suggested she carried authority the advisors hadn't granted her, threatened all of that. So they made sure the rest of the pack, and eventually the neighboring packs, learned about Sarah. Not the true story, careful and complicated, but a version twisted just enough to be dangerous. A human woman who had somehow gained influence over the Alpha King. Whispers of manipulation. Whispers that questioned whether Cale was fit to rule if a woman with no wolf blood could apparently steer his decisions so easily. The pressure built fast. Neighboring packs, always looking for reasons to question Silvermore's strength, used the rumors as an excuse to challenge Cale's authority. Within his own court, advisors who had smiled politely at Sarah for weeks suddenly grew cold and pointed, asking loudly why the Alpha continued housing a human at all. Cale faced a choice that had no comfortable answer: defend Sarah publicly and risk fracturing a pack already unsettled by rumor and rivalry, or distance himself from her, quietly, publicly, in a way that would calm the political storm and cost him something he had only recently allowed himself to want. He chose the pack. He told himself he had no other choice. He stood before his full court and announced, in a voice that gave away nothing, that Sarah Voss would be returned to her home, that the talk of prophecy was superstition unworthy of a serious court, that nothing between them meant what the rumors claimed. He did not tell Sarah himself. He let the announcement reach her the way announcements reach people who have been made small by someone else's decision, second-hand, through a guard who delivered the news awkwardly and left quickly, unwilling to watch her reaction. Sarah did not cry. She had spent her whole life learning to survive quiet rooms and unexplained silences, and this, in the end, was simply another silence to survive. She packed the few things she had brought with her, folding them with hands that were steadier than she expected, and told herself that she had never asked to be anyone's prophecy in the first place. But something in her, something old and tired of being underestimated, refused to leave without saying one last thing. Alone in her room, with her bag already packed by the door, she spoke a sentence in the first tongue. She hadn't planned it. She didn't fully understand, even as she said it, exactly what the words meant, only that they rose out of her the way the words had risen out of her that first night in the street, unbidden, true, impossible to hold back. The guard outside her door heard it. He went pale, turned, and ran, not toward Sarah, but toward the historian's chambers, calling for Ilsa in a voice that cracked with urgency. What Sarah had spoken, though she wouldn't learn the full weight of it until later, was a renouncement. In the first tongue, spoken with true intent, it was the closest thing the ancient bond had to an ending. Not a curse, not a spell, simply a truth spoken aloud with enough conviction to make itself real, that whatever thread had begun forming between two people would be cut, deliberately, before it finished tying itself. Cale was in the middle of a war council when it happened. He had been mid-sentence, discussing troop positions with 2 of his commanders, when something in his chest went suddenly, violently cold. It wasn't pain exactly. It was closer to absence, the specific and terrible feeling of something being removed that he hadn't fully realized was there. His wolf made a sound that every wolf in the room recognized immediately, though none of them had ever heard an alpha make it before. It wasn't a howl of anger or warning, it was something closer to grief, raw and unpracticed, the sound of something being lost before it had ever been properly claimed. Kale stood so fast, his chair scraped hard against the stone floor. He didn't explain himself to his commanders. He didn't wait for anyone's permission. He walked out of the middle of his own war council, something he had never once done in 4 years of ruling, and moved through the halls of Silvermore faster than dignity generally allowed for an alpha king. He reached Sarah's chambers just as she was stepping into the hallway, bag over her shoulder, chin lifted in the particular way people lift their chins when they are determined not to let anyone see how much something has cost them. She stopped walking when she saw him, not because she wanted to, because some part of her, despite everything, still hadn't finished waiting to see what he would do. "You should be halfway to the gates already," Kale said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I was going," Sarah said. "I still am." "Don't." The word came out of him plainly, without any of the careful control he usually wrapped around everything he said. Sarah watched something in his face crack open, the way ice cracks when the weather finally turns, all at once, after holding for a long time. "You made it very clear where I stand," she said, "in front of your entire court." "I made a mistake," he said, "a large one. I have made exactly one other mistake that size in my life, and it cost me 4 years of feeling nothing at all. I am not making it twice." Sarah crossed her arms, unwilling to make this easy for him, though something in her chest had already begun loosening despite herself. "Say it plainly then. No prophecy, no pack politics. What are you choosing?" He looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has finally decided he is done running from. "You," he said, "not the words you speak, not what my historians think you mean for my bloodline. You. Whatever that costs me with the rest of them, I would rather pay it than spend 1 more year the way I've spent the last 4. Something in Sarah's chest, something that had been braced and guarded since the moment the guard delivered Kale's announcement, finally let go. She stepped forward and spoke, quietly, in the first tongue, a phrase she had never used before and somehow knew exactly how to shape. It wasn't a phrase from any of the old texts Ilsa had shown her. It came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere that felt like it had been waiting inside her for this exact moment. Kale's breath caught. He didn't need Ilsa or any historian to tell him what the words meant. He felt it the way he had felt the renouncement, immediate and total, except this time it wasn't cold that spread through his chest. It was warmth, unfamiliar after 4 years of deliberate numbness, and he reached out and took her hand like a man finally allowed to touch something he had spent a long time convincing himself he didn't need. "I accept," Sarah said, this time in words they both understood. Down the hallway, Ilsa and 2 other historians stood frozen, having arrived just in time to witness the moment the old prophecy stopped being a disputed fragment in a dusty book and became, instead, something true, standing right in front of them. The pack did not accept the change quietly. Word spread fast, the way word always does in places built on rumor and rivalry, and within days Kale found himself facing a full council of neighboring pack leaders who had gathered specifically to question whether a human Luna could possibly hold any legitimate place in Silvermore's line. Sarah stood beside Kale through the entire hearing, and when the council's spokesperson demanded proof that she carried anything more than a convenient trick of memory, she didn't wait for Kale to answer for her. She spoke, at length, in the first tongue, addressing the full council the way she might have addressed a room of historians back at her old archive, carefully, precisely, without performance, simply because she had run out of patience for explaining herself in a language too clumsy for what needed saying. She spoke about bloodlines and inheritance, and the particular weight certain words carry when spoken with true intent rather than recited by rote. Halfway through, several council members who had walked in prepared to challenge her found themselves unexpectedly moved, some to silence, a few to something closer to tears, without being entirely sure why. The first tongue, it turned out, carried more than meaning. It carried the specific gravity of something ancient and true, and few people, wolf or human, could stand in front of it unaffected. By the end of her address, the opposition that had gathered so confidently against her had largely lost its footing. The council did not fully understand what they had witnessed, but they understood enough to know that dismissing it as trickery would make fools of them all. The rogue attacks that had plagued the border towns, the same kind of attack that had first brought Sarah and Cale together, stopped not long after. The dark magic that had been fueling them, something the pack's enemies had been quietly using to destabilize Silvermore's borders, unraveled once the bloodline it had been targeting was no longer vulnerable in the way it had been for 4 long years. Ashwick, and towns like it, went back to being ordinary places where people locked their doors at night out of old habit rather than fresh fear. Cale did not become an easy man overnight. He remained exacting, careful, sometimes difficult in the particular way of someone who had spent years training himself not to need anything too visibly. But he learned, slowly, to let certain doors stay open instead of guarding them so fiercely. He learned 3 phrases in the first tongue that he used at exactly the right moments, small and quiet, meant only for Sarah, and every time he used them correctly, her whole face changed in a way that made the effort of learning them entirely worth it. Sarah did not become a wolf. She remained entirely human, sharp-tongued, endlessly curious, more comfortable in a room full of old books than in a room full of pack politics. But she stopped feeling like a stranger, standing at the edge of a world that wasn't hers. She found her place in it slowly, not because a prophecy demanded it, but because she chose it, every day, in the specific and stubborn way she chose most things in her life. Sometimes, in the evenings, she thought about her grandmother, about all those nights of reciting words she didn't understand, about a woman who had known, somehow, decades in advance, exactly what her granddaughter would eventually need. Sarah never got the chance to ask her grandmother why, or how she had known, or what it had cost her to keep that secret for so long. But she liked to think her grandmother would have approved of how it all turned out, not because Sarah had become anyone's prophecy fulfilled, but because she had become, in her own stubborn and quietly determined way, exactly who she had always been. The prophecy had simply been smart enough to notice that first. And somewhere in the mountain halls of Silvermore, on quiet evenings when the fires burned low and the pack finally slept, an alpha king who had once believed himself permanently closed to feeling anything sharply again, sat beside the one woman who had cracked that shut door open, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not mind the draft at all.